Welcome to the next video on math formulas. In this video, we're going to be going over all of the formulas that contain the if or ifs extension onto the normal formulas that we're used to, such as sum, count, and average. Let's get into it. We're back to that same May invoices table, and it's by invoice, and it tells us the customer ID and what that customer purchased, the quantity of what they purchased, the price of those items, and then the extended price to find out the total of the invoice. And it's split by invoices again, you can see here. What if your boss comes up to you at the end of the month and says, hey, how much did X customer spend with us this past month? Or how many orders did they place this month? Or what was the average price of each order? We'll be able to easily answer those questions with these formulas. Let's start by doing the sum if formula first. As you can see, it says that it adds the cells specified by a given condition or criteria. So it's adding the cells in a range, but it only does the ones that meet a certain condition. So that's perfect if we want to go ahead and sum up only the rows that contain a certain customer ID. So let's use this customer ID right here, this 8154. You can see it's up here in the customer ID column, 8154, and then here as well. And so if we look at these arguments in this formula, it says it needs a range, then the criteria, then a sum range. So by default, if this is the sum range, then this other range must be in regards to the criteria. So I'm going to grab the customer ID and lock it up with F4 to put those dollar signs in, put a comma, go onto the criteria, and I'm looking again for this 8154, this customer ID. So I'm going to grab that, lock it up again, F4, comma, and then the sum range is the extended price. I want to know how much did he spend for the entire month. And again, lock it up, F4, and the parentheses. Now that equals $17.63 and 50 cents. And you're probably wondering, does that truly add up to that amount? And feel free to go ahead and check it, grab this with the sum formula, add it up, and it does, so that's fine. And let's continue on to the sum if formula. Let's drag this up here, see what Excel says. It says it counts the number of cells within a range that meet the given condition. So it's not going to count everything in a range. It's going to count only the ones that meet the criteria. So you're going to give the range and then tell it the criteria. Now the range is the customer ID. And we're looking to see how many of these items in this range equal this customer ID right here. I'm going to lock that up. And it returns 6. And that makes sense because there's 3 here and 3 here. So that does work. Now the last one that we're going to go over here in this range is the average if formula, and it's really the same thing as the sum if. It just takes the average, and it actually has the exact same arguments as the sum if. So it has the range, criteria, and the average range. So instead of typing it, like we're about to do here, let me just put a little apostrophe there, and I'm going to grab everything that we just typed up here in the sum if formula, and then come back in here and paste it, get rid of that apostrophe, and let it go. So this is the same thing. We're using this column to use our criteria on, and using this customer ID for the criteria. And we're saying average this column if it meets that criteria, this specific customer ID. So we can verify this by doing sum divided by the count, and that would give us the average. So 293.92. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and move on to these ifs statements. The sum ifs formula is basically the exact same thing, and as you probably guessed it, it just goes ahead and grabs multiple criteria, hence the plural s at the end of the formula. So instead of having one criteria like we did over here with just the customer ID, we can now put in another criteria, which we'll use with this one right here, this red. It's the product ID that we're going to be filtering on or using as a criteria. This formula, though, it starts off a little bit different. It asks for the sum range instead of just a range. So you need to input the sum range first, which would be this extended price. Lock that up with F4, comma. Then you'll grab your first criteria range. And that would be, let's go do our first one with the customer ID. Lock it up, F4, comma. Then it's saying what specific criteria do we need to match within this criteria range? Well, customer ID, we want to match this ID. F4 again, comma. The second range, so what else needs to be true for the formula to add it? Well, we also wanted to look at this product ID because our boss said, well, I only want to see how many times they purchased this particular product. So we'll put that in there, comma, and we're looking at this specific product ID. F4 one more time, close it up, hit enter. Now this customer went ahead and spent right around $200 in the month of May for this specific product. Now let's go ahead and try to figure out how many times did they buy that product. And in the formula, you can see that it's asking for the first criteria range, and which would be, just like we did in the first example, the customer ID range. And specifically, we want to match it up to this ID and lock it up with F4, comma. Here's the new part. What's our next criteria? Well, our next criteria range is in the product ID column. Lock that range up, and we're trying to find this specific criteria, this specific product ID in that range. So when all of those criteria is equal, we find that there's 2 products that they purchased last month that total up about $200. And I think you get it. So let's just go ahead and write out this average ifs formula, and let's do the same way we did with the average if and go up here into sum ifs and steal that formula's arguments, because it's truly the exact same arguments that it's asking for. So the formula will work perfectly if it's working perfectly above in this one. We can test this by saying the sum divided by the count should equal the average, and it does. Now you probably didn't notice, but I put data validation to both the customer ID and the product ID. You can see this drop down, and I can switch it to a different customer ID, and all of my formulas will update. And same thing with my product ID. I can try to pick out a different product and see how many times that they purchased it, how much it cost them, and things like that. So this is kind of a cool quick summary table with dynamically changing data based on how we wrote these formulas.